Peter B. Collins News and Comment. It's Friday, June 5th, 2020. In Minneapolis, the thin blue wall is crumbling. In the case of the police killing of George Floyd. Now, it was just yesterday I was ruminating about this, that my view is that the biggest problem in cleaning up corrupt and brutal police forces is that the good officers don't turn in the so-called bad apples. We hear all about the bad apples. There are just a few of them. People say the number is infinitesimal. Well, I don't believe that. Now, I do know police officers who are honorable, who are not brutal goons. But at the same time, the complicity of those who remain silent when they are witnesses to brutality, to murder, to other criminality, to the falsification of police reports, this is the biggest impediment to cleaning up the corrupt and violent-prone police operations we have in this country. So I'm very pleased to report that at the arraignment yesterday of the other three officers who were witnesses to the suffocation of George Floyd at the knee of Derek Chauvin, two of them, who are mere rookies, made it clear that they were not going to support the actions of former Officer Chauvin. And the third is cooperating with authorities. So this is a clean break from what has been known as the thin blue line, the blue wall of silence, the no snitch rule that applies in prisons and in police forces almost equally. And I consider this to be an excellent development that could lead to significant changes. Now, you can argue that these guys facing 40 years in prison, if they are convicted of aiding and abetting Chauvin, they did what any prudent individual would do. And that's fair enough. But if this can set a standard for the future, where we don't have officers who lie, falsify reports, and otherwise act in a criminal manner, well, we could see some real change. So it turns out that, two of these guys were so fresh. Earl Gray, a lawyer for Mr. Lane, let's see what his first name is, Thomas Lane, said that the day of the incident was only his fourth day on the police force. And former Officer Quang, age 26, was completing only his third shift as a full-fledged officer. So it's possible that Chauvin was trying to indoctrinate the new guys, just like gangs indoctrinate people. You got to get your hands dirty. You got to show us that you're willing to commit a crime. You're willing to kill somebody in order to prove your loyalty. So that's speculation on my part, and we will see as we progress to trial if they testify against Chauvin, and if they do so in a, completely credible way. So another positive development, Minneapolis officials announced an agreement to immediately ban the use of chokeholds and strangleholds today. And that's long overdue. Just like shooting to kill is often gratuitous, and police departments have not done enough to train officers to avoid using fatal gunshots in cases where It is clearly not warranted. So I want to preface this by saying that I am no fan of Al Sharpton. I've seen him over the years preen for TV cameras, operate in a really self-serving manner. And I've actually been around Sharpton 3 or 4 times in broadcast events where we call it Radio Row. And we each get a position, and they bring us guests who are related to the topic. I sat next to him at the Democratic National Convention in Denver. I was a row in front of him at Radio Row at a couple of events related to health care reform in Washington, D.C. And I was polite. I introduced myself at one point, and he wasn't interested. He, at the time was hosting a radio program before he kind of leveraged his way onto MSNBC. And I tell you that because I was completely impressed by the powerful eulogy that he delivered at the first memorial service for George Perry Floyd that was held in Minneapolis yesterday. And he said, George Floyd's story has been the story of black folks. Because ever since 400 years ago, the reason we could never be who we wanted and dreamed of being is you kept your knee on our neck. We were smarter than the underfunded schools you put us in, but you had your knee on our neck. We could run corporations and not hustle in the streets, but you had your knee on our neck. We had creative skills. We could do whatever anybody else could do, but we couldn't get your knee off our neck. It is time to stand up and say, get your knee off our necks. And there was more to the speech. It was, I saw several excerpts of it. And while I think he is a self-styled leader of the African-American community, in the mold of Jesse Jackson, much more than Martin Luther King Jr., what he had to say was pretty powerful. He called for a new march on Washington later this summer to stand up for the civil rights and the right not to be killed when you're stopped by a police officer. And he noted the broader participation of whites in the protests that have been generated by the police killing of George Floyd. And so despite my bias against Al Sharpton, I give him high marks for the rhetoric and the leadership that he demonstrated yesterday. So this is so dispiriting because Trump is at it again. It's all about him, and he is trying to spin up a positive story based on the flimsy and flaky unemployment numbers that were just published. And the estimates of the unemployment figures were only off by 10 million from the projections that were issued just about 2 weeks ago, based on preliminary data from May. And because, and you have to put this in context, okay, the unemployment rate dropped from an official number of 14.7 in April to 13.3 in May. And it had been expected to shoot up to about 20 million. Now, part of this is that states that reopened called back workers. And they're also in an analysis from the Bureau of Labor Statistics and commentary published at New York Magazine. That's where I got this. Millions of furloughed workers appear to have mistakenly assigned themselves to the unemployed but absent category. And as a result, the Bureau of Labor Statistics thinks that the overall rate is actually ticked up to 16.3% officially. But Trump's not interested in those kinds of details. He lives in the moment. So he grasps for this as good news. And in a Rose Garden press event, Trump, in a bizarre misappropriation of George Floyd's legacy and his brutal death at the hands of a police officer, actually the knee, excuse me, he had these bizarre remarks.
Equal justice under the law must mean that every American receives equal treatment in every encounter with law enforcement, regardless of race, color, gender, or creed. They have to receive fair treatment from law enforcement. They have to receive it. We all saw what happened last week. We can't let that happen. Hopefully George is looking down right now and saying, this is a great thing that's happening for our country. This is a great day for him. It's a great day for everybody. This is a great day for everybody. This is a great, great day in terms of equality.
Yeah, great. It's just great. I mean, this is the guy who ordered armed military people from the National Guard to use their batons to forcibly eject people from the street between the White House and Lafayette Square so that he could go to the St. John's Church for his Bible, well, I was going to say humping, but he held it up, his use of the Bible as a prop. And by the way, let me dig into my stack here, because down here I wanted to just briefly note that Trump's numbers are dropping precipitously among evangelicals. And among white Catholics, he's down 27%. The number for white evangelicals has dropped 15 percentage points just in the last 3 months. This is mostly related to his bungling of the coronavirus pandemic, but it certainly can't be helped by his authoritarian posture this week. Also, after Trump made that bizarre claim, he sat down to sign a bill, and I don't know exactly what bill it was because it was all overshadowed by his remarks. And then he was challenged by the African-American reporter from PBS, Yamiche Alcindor. And she said, well, look, the unemployment rate was up slightly for African Americans and up 0.5 point for Asian Americans. How can you claim victory? And he appeared to be dismissive of her and of other reporters in the crowd, but he just shook his head and said, you people, or something to that effect. And also there are complaints from the media who attended this event, because initially their chairs had been set up with a good distance in between them, social distancing, right? And then some minions came out of the White House and placed the chairs much closer together. This led to a complaint from the White House Press Association, and Trump made a gratuitous remark from the podium that you look much better sitting closer together. And it's as if he just wanted to force them to, violate the recommendations for social distancing, physical distancing, because he has contempt for the whole process. Now, Joe Biden correctly responded to Trump's remark, said for the president to try to put words in the mouth of George Floyd, I frankly think is despicable. And I agree with the vice president on that. But he's recovering from his own gaffe delivered to actor Don Cheadle during an online discussion on race relations last night. And as if he was channeling Hillary Clinton from her remark in the 2016 campaign about the baskets of deplorables in the Republican Party. And by the way, when you looked at the full context of her remark, it was not nearly as tone-deaf as the line itself. But get this. Biden says to Don Cheadle, the words a president says matter. When a president stands up and divides people all the time, you're going to get the worst of us to come out. And then he offers his own divisive comment here. The guy who wants to be president. Do we really think this is as good as we can be as a nation? I don't think the vast majority of people think that. There are probably anywhere from 10% to 15% of the people out there that are just not very good people. But that's not who we are. The vast majority of the people are decent. We have to appeal to that. We have to unite people, bring them together. But the gaffe-prone Joe Biden delivered another soundbite that's already being exploited by the Trump campaign. Now, one of the darkest aspects of Trump's decision to make a show of force right in front of the White House, where he's built a wall around the Pennsylvania Avenue perimeter. He finally got his wall. Now he's just got to get Mexico to pay for it, right? Well, that corridor is now being patrolled by troops in unmarked uniforms. And when reporters have asked them, hey, where are you from? What's your unit? The most they'll say is that they are working for the Department of Justice. And some people have interpreted that to mean that they are prison guards, and there are reports that prison guards have been flown in from federal lockups, including some from Texas. But we don't know. And we don't actually know who they report to. Now, at one point, Bill Barr, the Attorney General, has been told that he was designated to run this operation. Then Trump announced, and perhaps it was a surprise to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Milley, that Milley's in charge. But this is a very dangerous situation. And I wonder if some of these people are mercenaries. Are they contract security forces under the direction of former Blackwater Field Marshal Eric Prince? Well, I don't know. But it seems to be a page out of the Putin playbook in Donbass, where at one point he said, well, these are just volunteers from the Russian army. But they wore uniforms with no insignia, and they would not declare who they were under the command of. So I find this very uncomfortable. And I want to give credit to Rachel Maddow, who devoted a segment of her show last night to trying to figure out who these armed goons are. There was also the incident earlier this week where 2 helicopters were used to fly extremely low over protesters to buzz them, to intimidate them. And last night, Anderson Cooper had on the retired General Gayot, I think is his name, who ran the operations in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. He said, look, I was the ops manager for the Joint Chiefs of Staff. I know that to fly a chopper in Washington, D.C., because of the controlled airspace there, requires approvals from the very, very top. And so these are highly illegal actions. And they're done in a very murky way. No transparency. And the most uncomfortable person, I believe, is Muriel Bowser. She is the mayor of Washington. And because Washington does not have statehood status, her powers are sharply limited. And so she was not consulted when federal officials rolled out members of the DEA, the whole list of federal agencies who have people on the street in Washington right now is, well, you need more than both hands and all your fingers to count them. And it just has the deep whiff not just of tear gas, but of fascism. And we need to get to the bottom of it. So Mayor Bowser appeared on Maddow's show and also on the PBS NewsHour last night. She is smart and capable and really, explain the situation about the limits of authority that she has. But one of the things she did that is under her authority is she decided to rename the street in front of the White House Black Lives Matter Plaza. And this morning, crews showed up at 4 a.m. and in big, yellow, bold letters, they painted Black Lives Matter Plaza right on the pavement. And then they erected a signpost at the corner of 16th and H Streets. Black Lives Matter PLZ. So I think that's a very interesting touch. Now, we are also learning the Park Police has had to confirm that the use of tear gas was involved in clearing the street there on Monday for Trump's biblical moment. And this is something he has denied, Bill Barr has denied. But they said, well, that's not 100% accurate. And also, yesterday we reported that Mark Esper, who is clinging by his fingernails to his job as Secretary of Defense, after repeatedly infuriating Trump, we are told, one of the issues was that he had to back down on an order that he had approved or at least not interfered on from the Pentagon to send the troops that had been brought to Washington back to their bases in Fort Bragg and in Fort Drum, New York. And late yesterday, Trump relented after humiliating Mark Esper and says that he has allowed them to return to their respective bases. Now, the incident on Monday has led to a lawsuit already. The ACLU, on behalf of Black Lives Matter, has filed suit in the federal court there in Washington, accusing Trump and other officials of violating their constitutional rights, engaging in an unlawful conspiracy to violate those rights. So this will be before us for some time, as you can imagine. Also, the Pentagon has ordered the remaining National Guard members, again, they're under control of the federal government, not the mayor of D.C., to essentially disarm. They are not to carry firearms or ammunition as they continue some patrols of the District of Columbia. And in the feud between Trump and Twitter, a new wrinkle. The Trump campaign had posted a video that, in my view, misappropriates the story and death of George Floyd due to a copyright complaint. The video had been retweeted 7,000 times, including by Trump and his boy Don Jr., but they said that a copyright owner has filed a complaint. And at least in this case, they're treating Trump like any other person who puts up a link on Twitter to something that they don't have the complete rights to use. So as I speak to you, I offer my sympathies to the people of Bangor, Maine, because Trump is making another photo op visit to a state that he hopes to hold on to. And I think it's interesting because Susan Collins, who at every critical moment after posturing like she is stricken by conscience and can't support a Trump or Republican position, she caves. Well, when she heard Trump was coming to Maine, she made plans not to be in Maine today. But the Democratic governor of Maine, Janet Mills, first on the conference call last Monday, where she was told to dominate her protesters, she piped up and said, "Mr. President, please don't come to Maine." And that apparently, just redoubled his determination to do that. You tell him not to do something, and he must do it. So in advance of his arrival, Governor Mills announced as the individual responsible for the health and safety of the people of Maine, including those who support and do not support the president. I again ask the president to check his inflammatory rhetoric at the door and abandon the divisive language that sows seeds of distrust among our people. The governor said that she hoped Trump would appeal to the best in all people, lead with courage and compassion, and that those who are planning to gather, either in support or in protest of his visit, would do so with respect and safely amid the pandemic. My old buddy Brad Friedman at the Brad blog, who has long covered election integrity issues, notes that we now have enough evidence to accuse Donald Trump of voter fraud. And we can even up the ante to irritate him more and call it absentee voter fraud. And the issue is, where is his official residence? So when he filed in Florida requesting an absentee ballot for the primary there, so he could vote for himself, he listed his residence as the White House. And that was kicked back by a Florida authority saying, hey, dude, if you're going to vote in Florida, you have to declare a residence in Florida. So he said, okay, and he declared Mar-a-Lago as his residence. Only that conflicts with the 1993 agreement that he made when he purchased the property and turned it from a single-family residence into a commercial club. He agreed that no one could actually live there, and there are restrictions on members of the club. I think that they're limited to 2 weeks a year that they're permitted to stay there. And this is a long-running contentious issue. So after the White House was rejected as his legal residence, he filed it with Mar-a-Lago, and the way Brad describes it, maybe Florida generously granted him a mulligan. But that fundamentally, he is a felonious, fraudulent voter under the law in Florida. I want to remind folks that the Peter B. Collins Podcast Community Fund has been funded by some contributions from me and many generous contributions from our listeners. We still have a healthy balance in the fund, and I don't have any grant applications to announce today. So if you're one of those people, there are a third of Americans who have filed for unemployment, haven't received it. You're coming up short on your grocery budget, or maybe you need to pay off a past due bill. I'd like to help you out with a $100 grant. Just email Peter at peterbcollins.com. And so far, we have not declined a single request. Alan McLeod, Mint-Press News, reporting on one of the details of the tactics of the New York Police Department, which is distinguishing itself as the most brutal in the shutdown of protesters and curfew violators in recent days. And the curfew extends through Monday, June 8th. And one of the tactics they've been using is, turns out the NYPD has a small fleet of yellow vehicles that look like taxi cabs. They're called cop cabs. And what McLeod has seen is that video circulated last night shows police officers tricking protesters trying to go home by posing as taxis and then arresting them for breaking the curfew. That is really slimy. And it's almost as slimy as the use of kettling. And I first learned that term at the Democratic Convention in Boston, 2004, the coronation of John Kerry, the next president of the United States before he got swift-boated. And kettling is where you use, plastic fencing. I know it as snow fencing. And you set up perimeters. But kettling can also be used as a way of creating a dragnet, just like they do with fish. And we've seen 3 different cases now over the last few nights in New York where these have been used to entrap protesters who were merely in violation of curfew. They weren't violent. They weren't provoking the police. And at a certain point without provocation. They basically tighten the net and then pounce on the people inside it. Officers swinging batons turned a demonstration that had been largely peaceful into a scene of chaos. That was last night in downtown Brooklyn. And this has been used, says the New York Times, over the past 3 days, despite the very limited looting that has occurred since last weekend, which is when it kind of peaked. And maybe the looters have figured out there isn't much else left to grab. But this puts a lot of pressure on Bill de Blasio, who is the too-tall mayor of New York, who got elected on a pledge to clean up the police department. And he's done that by increasing their budgets, and over the past week, he has indefensibly defended the brutality of too many of his officers. He even defended the cops who drove their squad SUVs into a crowd. And I've reviewed that video again. And the one vehicle that was up against a little, section of perimeter fencing, a barricade, with maybe 30 people on the other side, he had a clear path to back up and get out of there. And de Blasio defended him, saying, oh, they were throwing water bottles and traffic cones at his car. Well, yesterday, Mayor de Blasio appeared at a memorial for George Floyd in Brooklyn. He drew immediate jeers, despite pleas from one of the organizers to respect George Floyd and not to boo. Instead, people turned their backs on the mayor, chanted "Resign" and "I can't breathe," drowning out de Blasio as he gave a speech that only lasted 90 seconds before he hustled away from the podium. And it's reported today that the mayor has softened his tone, pledging to review reports of police officers behaving inappropriately, promising he would announce disciplinary measures against some officers shortly. Well, I think that's playing both sides. And he's not going to win the affection of the men in blue. I guess they're women, too. I don't want to be sexist. But it is amazing at these times to see the true color and loyalties of these people who claim to be progressive. Then there's the issue of all the people who've been arrested, who have faced very slow processing, languishing in lockups with as many as, 30 or 40 people in a single cell, limited food distribution, and limited access to attorneys and to an arraignment where they could either be bailed out or, I guess, sent to Rikers Island or some other, maybe the Tombs, jail in New York City. There have been 500 people reported to be arrested and charged with looting. And if they are charged with burglary, it's a felony that is not a bailable offense under the state's new law. And, of course, one can be falsely accused of burglary or looting, having only been a protester who violated curfew or got into a skirmish with the cops. And Ryan Devereaux at The Intercept is reporting today the case of Joe Feingold. He was in his apartment in Brooklyn. He heard the sound of police beating protesters right outside his building. This was on Wednesday night. So he ran outside to see what was going on, and almost immediately he was tossed to the ground by a senior New York City police officer. They're the ones in the white shirts. He was then thrown into a police van, placed under arrest along with 4 other individuals for having ostensibly violated the curfew. They were taken to the 78th precinct, where they told they were being cited for violating the 8 p.m. curfew. And then they were led into an interrogation room. And there were 2 questioners, one a New York Police Department intelligence officer and the other an FBI agent. Feingold said a third officer confirmed the affiliations of the two men as he was being discharged. The FBI agent's line of questioning was focused on his political views. We want to know who's hijacking your movement and making it violent. Feingold said that is what he said verbatim. So, number one, the involvement of the FBI in these investigations of curfew violators shows that they are desperately trying to find links to Antifa, maybe Proud Boys and Boogaloo Boys, but most likely they're trying to pin the violent actions on leftists. And today at Shadowproof, the able and estimable Kevin Gostola examines the claims, mostly of elected officials, that large numbers of protesters, and particularly those who are thought to become violent, were outsiders. Well, Minnesota Public Radio analyzed county jail records, found 83% of people who were arrested in connection with the protests on May 28th and 29th were from Minnesota, 56% from Minneapolis or St. Paul. And remember, the governor, in that 2 a.m. local time news conference that I watched last Friday night, Saturday morning, he used the number of 80% being outsiders. Then we look at Washington, D.C., a local CBS television station investigated claims by Trump and Bill Barr that rioting and looting was the work of outside agitators. So, of the 104 arrests reviewed by the TV station, 79 subjects listed their residence as within 20 miles of D.C. Of those, 50 reside in the district itself. Only one person arrested over the weekend, a 29-year-old man from North Carolina, listed an address outside either D.C., Maryland, or Virginia. Then in Seattle, police listed general addresses for 62 of the people picked up Saturday and Sunday for looting, assault, and other crimes. Only 2 of the arrested were from out of state. All the rest are from Washington State. 23 have Seattle addresses, while the others are from close-in Puget Sound cities. So I have to say it is a plausible scenario, because we don't imagine that people who show up for a peaceful protest include those who are prone to violence. But it doesn't show up in the data so far. Also, at The Intercept, Nick Terse, who has done a great job of exposing the United States' lengthy and multiple tentacles of military bases, particularly he's written about AFRICOM. Well, he obtained some documents that reveal that in 2018, the Pentagon conducted a war game called JLAS. And among the scenarios that they war-gamed is a situation in which members of Generation Z, driven by malaise and discontent, launch a Z-bellion sometime in the 2020s. And the plot also featured other scenarios involving Islamist militants in Africa, anti-capitalist extremists, successors to the Islamic State. But according to the scenario, many members of Gen Z, psychologically scarred by 9/11, the Great Recession, crushed by college debt, and disenchanted with their employment options, this was pre-COVID, have given up on their hopes for a good life and believe the system is rigged against them. Funny how so many of those war games play out in reality. I want to thank listener Andrea Hegland, or do you say Andrea, who contacted me a couple of days ago and offered to submit some research about the impact of vitamin D in relation to those infected with COVID-19. And she cites a Northwestern University report based on research that was issued in April. They studied publicly available global data from the COVID-19 pandemic and observed that patients from countries with high mortality rates had lower levels of vitamin D compared to those from countries that were not affected as severely. They found a significant correlation between vitamin D deficiency and COVID-19 mortality. And she quotes from a press release from one of the paper's authors. Cytokine storm can severely damage lungs and lead to acute respiratory syndrome and death in patients. This is what seems to kill a majority of COVID-19 patients, not the destruction of the lungs by the virus itself. The authors noted that the findings might be another key to helping protect vulnerable populations with a prevalence of vitamin D deficiency, including African Americans and elderly populations. So I have heard about this, and it's interesting to see the research. The Northwestern report is buttressed by a combined effort by Trinity College Dublin and the University of Liverpool, and a May release of a study from Harvard University and Brigham Women's Hospital. So I think this is very interesting, and I'm happy to share it with you. She also went into a second topic here, where she describes hydroxychloroquine as one of the world's safest drugs. She notes that it's been in use for many years. In 2017, it was the 128th most commonly prescribed medication in the U.S., with more than 5 million prescriptions for malaria, rheumatoid arthritis, and lupus. And then we get the kind of dizzying array of studies. And one that came from the University Hospital Institute in Marseille, France, related to 2 separate studies in March of this year. Quote, we show that HCQ, hydroxychloroquine, is efficient in clearing viral nasopharyngeal carriage of the COVID-19 in only 3 to 6 days in most patients. A significant difference was observed between HCQ-treated patients and controls starting even on day 3 post-inclusion. These results are of great importance because of a recent paper showing that the mean duration of viral shedding in patients from COVID-19 was 20 days, 37 days for the longest duration. Continuing to quote here, our preliminary results also suggest a synergistic effect of the combination of HCQ and azithromycin. Azithromycin has been shown to be active in vitro against Zika and Ebola viruses and to prevent severe respiratory tract infections when administered to patients suffering viral infection. And then Andrea asks some questions. Is it possible that an off-patent drug like HCQ is unacceptable to the powers that be? Some have called it a populist drug. 1, because it's cheap and competes with potentially profitable treatments like remdesivir? Or 2, could it obviate the need for some to take a profitable vaccine? Now, the financial motivation in the world of pharmaceuticals is something that cannot be dismissed. And I am offended that there are researchers who then take out patents on diseases or treatments. Many of these are academics who then either partner with or form a for-profit corporation. And beyond the profit motive, Andrea raises a critical question here. If HCQ is not safe for COVID-19 patients, why is it considered safe for malaria, lupus, and arthritis? And I'm not qualified to answer that, but I think it's a good question. We know that the comments that have come from Dr. Fauci and others indicate that their concerns are about impact on hearts, and that one of the side effects of hydroxychloroquine is damage, including potential fatalities, based on heart conditions. So we're going to get some comments on this from Linda Lewis as part of her daily COVID-19 update. First, we try to always give you the current count. Worldwide, the deaths attributed to COVID-19 are now just under 400,000, and in the United States, it is closing in on 109,000. And Linda notes that Governor Cuomo has announced the reopening in New York beginning on Monday with a Phase 1. She also cites that the Department of Health and Human Services will require submissions of coronavirus test results to include information on the individual's race, ethnicity, age, and gender. And my only question is, why are they so late? That would seem to me to be standard operating procedure. This is one of the reasons why the data collected on COVID-19 and, the various calculations that people make to arrive at a fatality rate in comparison to the total number of cases is so dodgy. So now Linda goes into the latest on hydroxychloroquine. The Lancet published a retraction today of an article that alleged a risk of heart problems and death in some COVID-19 patients treated with HCQ. After publication of our Lancet article, several concerns were raised with respect to the veracity of the data and analyses conducted by Surgisphere Corporation and its founder and the co-author of the report, Sapan Desai. We launched an independent third-party peer review of Surgisphere with the consent of Dr. Desai to evaluate the origination of the database elements, to confirm the completeness of the database, and to replicate the analysis presented in the paper. Our independent peer reviewers informed us that Surgisphere would not transfer the full data set, citing client contracts and the full ISO audit report to their servers for analysis because it would violate client agreements and confidentiality requirements. As such, our reviewers were not able to conduct an independent and private peer review and therefore notified us of their withdrawal from the process, and so they can no longer vouch for the validity of that report. The study had led the World Health Organization to pause its Solidarity trial, a clinical trial of the drug by 35 participating countries, 400 hospitals. And this past Wednesday, the WHO announced it was asking investigators to resume their work. Now, on May 22nd, the day the now retracted study was published, a stat article by Matthew Herper called it the largest observational study so far on the use of chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine to treat COVID-19. But he cautiously noted the study cannot answer the question of whether or not hydroxychloroquine and chloroquine can help patients fight off COVID-19, or whether the drugs increase or decrease the death rates in those patients. Those answers can only come from large studies in which patients are randomly assigned to either receive the drugs or a placebo. And Linda Lewis notes, the controversy over this study illustrates an ongoing problem. Most Americans lack sufficient knowledge of statistics and research standards to evaluate medical studies, and I, for one, fall into that category. Confronted with a mysterious and dangerous disease that has upended lives, many of us are looking for a magic bullet. There are huge financial incentives for companies to produce a miracle drug, as well as career advancement incentives for researchers. And news media are eager to publish any new developments. In this environment, ideas about treatment are being circulated before they've been properly examined, creating enormous confusion for the public. Individuals without affordable health care are particularly vulnerable to claims that suggest they can self-treat. And we'll get to some eyebrow-raising examples for that in a moment. Somewhere in this toxic stew, a treatment for COVID-19 may exist, but there's no widespread consensus currently about what that is. Meanwhile, people could do themselves harm by taking the wrong advice. Those who have the means should check first with their personal physician. All should exercise caution in accepting as gospel claims based on studies that have not been fully vetted. Learning a few basics about statistics is enormously helpful, for example, in answering the question, does vitamin D protect against COVID-19? So on that front, she cites Bruce Troen, chief of the Division of Geriatrics and Palliative Medicine at the University of Buffalo. He says there is a strong body of evidence from before the pandemic demonstrating that vitamin D deficiency is correlated with an increased susceptibility to respiratory tract infections. However, he cautions, correlation does not equal causation. This is not proof that vitamin D status plays a role in the risk of death. He further cautions that 2 relevant studies are preprint studies. They have not been peer-reviewed by other experts. Quote, several research groups have been releasing preliminary results in this manner during the pandemic in order to disseminate information regarding the virus quickly. However, it is important to look at these studies with greater scrutiny than those accepted for publication in scientific journals. Now, Linda adds her own personal note. Basic concepts like these are critical to understanding how much relevance a study has for a particular patient, and underlying conditions add to the difficulty. What helps one person could be dangerous for another, even if we're talking about a common over-the-counter drug like aspirin. So, should people take vitamin D as a shield against the coronavirus? She turns to Dr. Donald Ford at the Cleveland Clinic. Quote, some of the articles out there have drawn the conclusion that it's safe and effective to take vitamin D to prevent COVID-19. That's an inappropriate conclusion at this time because all we can say is that in countries where people had lower levels of vitamin D, there were more cases of COVID-19. But this doesn't take into account the million other factors that could be contributing to that. My caution as a physician is before anyone does anything, they should talk to their doctor. And in a further comment from the Cleveland Clinic, Dr. Ford, your doctor can order a blood test to measure your levels of vitamin D. There are 2 types of tests that might be ordered. The most common is the 25-hydroxy vitamin D, known as 25-OHD for short. Test results will tell your doctor how much supplemental vitamin D you need. Too much vitamin D can be toxic. And here is Linda's contribution. The poison centers across the country have been receiving an increase in calls related to cleaners and disinfectants. Could it be because Trump talked about that? And in a report released today, they say people are engaging in extremely dangerous behaviors, including gargling with bleach. 4% of the people surveyed said that they drank or gargled bleach, soapy water, or other cleaning agents. 40% said that they'd engaged in at least one high-risk behavior, such as rinsing fresh fruit and vegetables with bleach. 18% of those surveyed reported applying cleaning agents directly to their skin. Wow, this is like the use of Windex in my big fat Greek wedding. 10% said that they had misted their bodies with a disinfectant spray. Is that Lysol? Thanks, Linda, for a very thorough report, and thanks to Andrea for her research as well. Oh, and just to add more to the dizzying reports on hydroxychloroquine, the Guardian reports today, June 5th, that according to the recovery trial at Oxford University, hydroxychloroquine does not work against COVID-19 and should not be given to any more hospital patients around the world. Martin Landry, Deputy Chief Investigator and Professor of Medicine and Epidemiology at Oxford, if you are admitted to hospital, don't take hydroxychloroquine. It doesn't work, he said. And Landry said the hype should now stop. It's being touted as a game changer, a wonderful drug, a breakthrough. This is an incredibly important result because worldwide we can stop using a drug that is useless, he said. The recovery trial is a randomized controlled trial described as a gold standard trial intended to find an answer to a question by recruiting patients in similar circumstances either to take the drug or to take a placebo. Okay. Again, I think there's a lot of information here, and at least as an amateur myself, it's hard to draw a conclusion. The New York Times, on further review, has declared that op-ed written by Senator Tom Cotton, headlined "Send in the Troops," with just a whiff of fascism, Well, we've examined the piece and the process leading up to its publication, the Times said. This review made clear that a rushed editorial process led to the publication of an op-ed that did not meet our standards. As a result, we're planning to examine both short-term and long-term changes to include expanding our fact-checking operation and reducing the number of op-eds we publish. Now, I still broadly support Tom Cotton's right to hold his opinions, even if they're fascistic, and to have them published in the New York Times. I am a staunch opponent of censorship. And I've been holding on to this for a few days. On May 29th, Matt Taibbi posted an article on Substack, not his Rolling Stone beat, and he cited how Michael Moore and Jeff Gibbs' new movie, Planet of the Humans, has been taken down from YouTube, and kind of like the Trump video I mentioned earlier, because of an alleged copyright infringement. Now, Michael Moore says that the film was heavily lawyered and does not violate any copyrights. It's covered by the Fair Use Supreme Court decision. But Matt Taibbi launches from there into the overall censorship that's underway right now. He said the significance of the Moore incident is that it shows a long-developing pattern of deletions and removals is expanding. The early purges were mainly of small fringe voices on either the far left or the far right, or people like Alex Jones. Then he lists others who have been censored recently. A pair of California doctors were taken off YouTube for declaring stay-at-home measures unnecessary. A right-wing British broadcaster and trumpeter of shape-shifting reptile theories, David Icke, was taken off YouTube. A video by Rockefeller University epidemiologist Newt Witnowski was taken down, apparently for advocating a herd immunity approach. These moves all came after the popular libertarian Zero Hedge was banned from Twitter, ostensibly for suggesting a Chinese scientist in Wuhan was responsible for coronavirus. In late April, the World Socialist website, which has been one of the few consistent critics of internet censorship and algorithmic manipulation, was removed from Reddit on the grounds that it was not reliable. And in early May, at least 52 Palestinian activists and journalists were removed from Facebook for not following community standards, part of a years-long pattern of removals made in cooperation with the Israeli government. So there are serious issues of censorship. COVID-19 is being used to control information that is viewed as skeptical or somehow out of the mainstream. And I believe that all views should be available for your consideration, just as I tried to be even-handed today regarding vitamin D and hydroxychloroquine. And we are losing some key tenets of our rights here in this country. And finally, two quick references to things that are underway in the news. Senate Republicans have moved to grant themselves new powers for a sprawling investigation into the investigation of Russiagate. And as you know, I believe that this will be a political operation. Nonetheless, I don't believe the official narrative of Russiagate. I do think that there was chicanery by members of our intelligence community, notably the FBI. Some of it has been exposed. And while this is clearly a political effort run by allies of Trump to try to turn the tables in time for the November election, I think that there is something to be investigated there, and we'll be watching it closely. And finally, the chief judge currently at Guantanamo, Douglas Watkins, has made an important ruling in the case of Majid Khan. Now, he went to high school in Baltimore. I don't know Majid Khan's citizenship, but he was accused of being a courier who delivered $50,000 of al-Qaeda money to help finance the 2003 bombing of the Marriott Hotel in Jakarta, Indonesia, that killed 11 people. He has pleaded guilty, and while there isn't a date for his sentencing, Basically, the arguments related to his sentencing were the subject of a ruling by the judge. And he said because Majid Khan was tortured, that he will consider a reduced sentence on the grounds that it was illegal pretrial punishment. And there's no question that he was tortured. He was held for 3 years in various CIA black sites. He was held in total darkness for a year, isolated in a cell with bugs that bit him. This is a courageous ruling from Colonel Watkins. And while I mostly view the so-called legal process at Guantanamo to be a kangaroo court, this offers a little contrast that is quite welcome. Thanks for joining me for my daily news and comment podcast. You're free to share it all over the place. You'll find it on YouTube. And I remain Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to